Germany had fallen silent. The guns that once thundered across Europe had stopped, but the echoes still lived inside every broken wall and hollow stomach. In the ruins of what was once the Third Reich, people did not speak of victory or defeat. They spoke of bread. Cities that had once glowed with light and pride now lay buried under rubble. Berlin was a skeleton of stone and ash. Hamburg smelled of smoke and sewage. In Frankfurt, mothers boiled weeds to keep their children alive. The Reich was gone, but hunger had survived. The victors called it peace. For the Germans, it felt like another kind of war. One fought not with bullets, but with emptiness. The winter of 1945 was merciless. The Allied bombings had not only destroyed factories and barracks, they had torn through bakeries, silos, railways, everything that kept a city breathing. Trains no longer came. Markets disappeared. Rats became a luxury meal. The average German family lived on less than 900 calories a day, half of what the body needs to stay alive. In the countryside, farmers guarded their fields like fortresses. In the cities, people traded wedding rings for potatoes. A single loaf of bread could decide who lived until morning. For years, propaganda had promised that the German people were chosen, the masters of Europe. Now those same people stood in line under Allied guards, waiting for crumbs from the very hands that had bombed their homes. They had been told the Americans were monsters, rich, decadent, cruel, men who killed for pleasure and laughed over the ashes of their enemies. But as the occupation began, something strange happened. Instead of punishment came paperwork. Instead of revenge came rations. Instead of soldiers shouting came clerks counting, measuring, recording. The first American trucks rolled into the ruins carrying crates marked with bold black letters, U.S. Army, food supplies. The sight of it was surreal. These were the same stars and stripes painted on bombers that had flattened Dresden and Cologne, now printed on boxes of flour and sugar. Children watched in silence as soldiers unloaded sacks of wheat. Women stood frozen on the sidewalks, torn between gratitude and humiliation. The smell of bread returned before its taste. From makeshift kitchens run by the occupying forces, the scent drifted through streets still thick with the odor of dust and burned flesh. It was sweet, warm, maddening. To many it smelled like betrayal. An old man in Cologne was heard whispering, "They feed us like pets to keep us quiet," but even anger could not fill an empty stomach. Within weeks, long lines formed outside distribution points. The Americans called them feeding centers. The Germans called them humiliation queues. Each person received a small tin of powdered milk, a handful of flour, maybe a can of meat. Enough to survive, never enough to feel human again. Among the soldiers overseeing the process was a young American lieutenant named Robert Keller. He was 23 years old, from Ohio, raised on church hymns and baseball. When he stepped into the ruins of Hamburg, he wrote in his diary, "I thought victory would feel clean, but it smells like hunger." His job was to distribute food, not forgiveness. But the two began to blur. Every morning, Keller stood behind a wooden table as hundreds of Germans, old men, widows, children with soot-stained faces, shuffled forward with ration cards in shaking hands. He was supposed to see them as the enemy, but hunger had no uniform. He once saw a boy, no older than 10, trying to hide a second ration card in his sleeve. The sergeant raised his hand to strike, but Keller stopped him. "Let him keep it," he said quietly. "He's just a boy." The sergeant frowned, but obeyed. The boy ran off into the ruins, clutching 2 small loaves, treasure in a dead city. That night, Keller couldn't sleep. He kept thinking of the contradiction, how the same army that dropped fire from the sky now dropped bread from trucks, how victory and mercy could wear the same face. The U.S. military called the relief operation "feeding the defeated." It was meant to prevent chaos, disease, rebellion, but inside every loaf of bread was a question that no propaganda could answer. Can kindness from the enemy ever feel clean? For the Germans who lined up each day, it was a wound that healed and hurt at the same time. A widow in Munich described the feeling in her diary. The bread tastes of ashes, yet I eat it. Children, however, did not know shame. Only hunger. To them, the Americans were magicians, men who carried chocolate in their pockets and sugar in their laughter. They called them Schokoladsoldaten, the chocolate soldiers. In one photo from May 1945, a small girl in a torn dress stands barefoot beside an American Jeep, holding a Hershey bar as big as her hand. Her face is dirty, but she is smiling. Behind her, a building still smokes. That image would travel the world, proof that even amid rubble, sweetness could survive. But not everyone saw it that way. In taverns lit by candlelight, whispers spread that the Americans wanted to make Germans weak, to drown their pride in sugar. Some veterans spat on the sight of soldiers handing out candy to children. "They kill our sons, then feed our daughters," one said bitterly. And yet every day the lines grew longer. Every morning the smell of baking rose again, the smell of survival. For the Americans, it was logistics. For the Germans, it was an identity crisis. For history, it was irony made flesh. The conqueror saving the conquered with food that tasted like forgiveness and humiliation mixed together. As spring warmed the ruins, rumors began to spread of something even larger, an operation unlike anything the world had seen. Planes, hundreds of them, loaded not with bombs, but with bread. The Americans were planning to feed an entire nation from the sky. People laughed at first. They had seen the sky only as death. They could not imagine it raining life. But soon, the drone of engines would return, and this time the people below would not run for cover. They said the sky above Germany would never bring peace again. For 6 years it had rained death, bombs, fire, and the scream of sirens that froze children in place. But in 1948, the same sky began to hum with a different sound. The roar of engines, yes, but not of war. They came not in squadrons, but in flocks. Hundreds of American planes heavy, not with explosives, but with hope. They carried flour, sugar, powdered milk, coal, and something more fragile: dignity. The war was over, but peace was breaking apart. Germany had been cut into pieces east and west, and in the center Berlin was dying again. The Soviets had closed every road, every railway, every canal. 2 million people trapped inside a starving city. No coal, no fuel, no food. Stalin's message was simple: let them starve. But the Americans refused to watch Berlin collapse. What came next was something no general had imagined, a plan to keep an entire city alive by air. They called it Operation Vittles. The Germans called it Die Luftbrücke, the air bridge. Every 3 minutes a plane would land, every 3 minutes another would take off. Day and night, through fog and exhaustion, pilots became lifelines. Each aircraft carried 10 tons of food or coal, enough to keep a family alive for a week, a neighborhood warm for a day. At first, no one believed it could work. Berliners had only seen American planes through smoke, falling bombs, falling fire. Now they saw silver wings slicing the clouds, and from those wings fell not destruction, but parachutes of candy. It began with one man, Gail Halverson, a pilot from Utah. After landing one afternoon, he saw a group of German children behind a fence, barefoot, watching silently. They didn't beg, they just watched. He reached into his pocket, broke 2 sticks of gum in half, and passed them through the wire. The children tore the wrappers into pieces just to smell the sweetness. That night, Halverson couldn't sleep. "They've had enough bombs," he wrote. "Maybe it's time to drop something else." The next day, he tied chocolate bars to handkerchiefs and dropped them from his plane, wiggling his wings as a signal. Tiny parachutes fluttered down over Berlin like snow, chocolate snow. Soon, letters arrived addressed simply to Uncle Wiggly Wings. Other pilots joined him. Thousands of candy parachutes rained down, Hershey bars, peppermint sticks, chewing gum. The same hands that once dropped death now dropped sweetness. But behind the smiles, the real battle raged. The blockade tightened, the weather worsened, engines failed, pilots flew until their eyes burned from exhaustion, planes crashed, men died. Yet the airlift never stopped. Every day more than 8,000 tons of supplies poured into Berlin. Each roar of an engine became the heartbeat of a city refusing to die. Mothers whispered, "When we hear the planes, we know God remembers us." By winter, the mission looked impossible. Snow-blinded pilots, ice-sealed runways. One aircraft burst into flames on landing, but even then, others kept flying. "We don't deliver cargo," said General Tunner. "We deliver faith." Spring came, and the impossible had become routine. The airlift had delivered over 2 million tons of food and coal. An entire city had survived without a single open road, no guns, no tanks, just bread and mercy. Then one May morning, Soviet guards vanished from their checkpoints. The blockade was over. The airlift had won. When the first trucks rolled into Berlin, people didn't cheer. They listened. For the first time in a year, the sky was silent. No engines, no parachutes, just stillness. At Tempelhof, Halvorsen stood beside his plane as children surrounded him. One handed him a crumpled note written in shaky German. "Thank you for showing us that the sky can bring hope." That night, Halvorsen sat on the wing of his aircraft, staring at the stars. The war had taken millions of lives, but one small act, a pilot dropping chocolate instead of bombs, had given something back to humanity. The Berlin airlift became a symbol, proof that compassion could travel faster than hate. And for those who had once watched bombs fall from the same sky, every bite of candy carried a message they would never forget. The same hands that destroyed us kept us alive. Yet forgiveness was not so simple. The candy melted quickly, the memories of fire did not. And as the planes departed one by one, Berliners were left with a question that still echoed through the ruins. Was mercy ever truly free? Or was it the softest weapon of all? The war had ended, but inside every German home another war began. Silent, invisible, and harder to win. The war between mercy and guilt. By 1949, bread once again filled Berlin's air with warmth, but behind every loaf lay humiliation. The city was alive because of its enemy. The same planes that had burned its streets now carried flour and hope. For many, that was harder to swallow than hunger itself. They queued for rations in silence, teachers, soldiers, mothers, clutching cards stamped with American ink. Every bite felt like surrender. Every spoonful whispered, "You survived because they let you." A nurse named Marta wrote, "When I eat their bread, I taste ashes, but pride cannot feed my son." Around her, others wrestled with the same truth. They were living proof that mercy can wound deeper than cruelty. The Americans called it relief, but the Germans felt stripped bare. They had been taught that strength was purity, that weakness was shame. Now they survived because of kindness, a concept their world had never made room for. In churches, priests spoke of forgiveness. In taverns, men cursed it. A baker in Hamburg murmured, "When they bombed us, I understood. When they helped us, I did not." Yet kindness spread like fire through the ruins. American soldiers built soup kitchens, reopened hospitals, handed out blankets and candy. Children adored them, called them chocolate soldiers. They chased their jeeps, waved flags, shouted, "Hello!" without fear. For the first time in years, the sound of laughter returned to the streets. But their fathers could not join in. They sat in silence, watching their children eat chocolate from the hands that once dropped bombs. Among the soldiers, guilt grew too. Lieutenant Robert Keller, who once bombed these same streets before feeding them, wrote in his notebook, "I see the faces I never saw from the sky. Maybe mercy is our punishment." For men like him, The relief missions were redemption disguised as duty. They had won the war with power, but were now trying to win peace with kindness, and it haunted them both ways. Meanwhile, something deeper was happening. English words crept into German speech. American movies flickered in rebuilt cinemas. Coca-Cola signs replaced swastikas on cracked walls. Children dreamed of baseball instead of battlefields. A quiet empire was rising, not with flags or soldiers, but with food, film, and music. The Germans called it the second occupation, one made of sugar and smiles. Some elders whispered that the Americans had conquered twice, once with bombs and again with bread. Yet the young didn't care. They had seen enough war to understand that kindness, even from an enemy, was worth keeping. Marta's son, 8 years old, licked the last crumbs of a Hershey bar from his hands. She smiled faintly, whispering, "He will never know hunger, but he will never know pride either." Outside, the streets buzzed with new life. The war had ended in flames, but survival was rebuilding in silence. Mercy had fed the stomachs of the defeated and starved their certainty. For some, it was grace. For others, it was submission. The line between the two blurred more each day. The Americans saw themselves as liberators. The Germans saw them as reminders, and between them, bread became a language that spoke louder than politics, the taste of guilt disguised as gratitude. In that fragile peace, one truth emerged, unspoken yet undeniable. The war had changed nations, but mercy had changed souls. By 1950, the ruins were gone, but the war never truly left. It had simply changed shape. The guns were silent, yet another kind of power had taken their place, quiet, polished, smiling. America no longer needed to conquer Germany with soldiers. It could do it with sugar, sound, and light. In the heart of Berlin, the first neon Coca-Cola sign flickered to life. The same city that once echoed with marching boots now pulsed with jazz and laughter. American jeeps rumbled past cafes, serving black market coffee, and radios played Frank Sinatra instead of marching anthems. A new rhythm had entered the ruins, one that tasted like freedom, but felt like control. The Marshall Plan poured money like rain into Europe's wounds. Factories roared again, roads rebuilt, cities glowed, but every shipment of wheat came wrapped in the same message, made in the USA. America was not just rebuilding a nation, it was rewriting it. Food became diplomacy, film became propaganda. Every chocolate bar, every movie reel, every jazz record whispered the same promise: we won the war and we will win your hearts. For most Germans, it was irresistible. After years of silence and starvation, the noise of life was intoxicating. American cigarettes, nylon stockings, chewing gum. They were more than luxuries. They were symbols of modernity, of a world that moved forward instead of backward. People who once saluted Hitler now queued for Hollywood. Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, the best years of our lives. Stories of pain, love, and hope that felt strangely personal. But not everyone was seduced. In dimly lit taverns, veterans muttered that Germany had lost its soul twice, first to war, then to comfort. "They rebuild us to make us like them," one said bitterly. "Freedom with a price tag." Yet the young generation didn't care. They danced, they smoked, they dreamed in English. They didn't see empire. They saw escape. Across Europe, the American presence grew like sunlight through cracks, soft, warm, unstoppable. Radios, jeans, cars, songs, all carried the same invisible flag. Historians would later call it soft power. But for those living through it, it was simpler. Survival wrapped in pleasure. Marta, the nurse who once trembled at the sound of American engines, now worked in a hospital built with Marshall Plan funds. Her son, now a teenager, wore blue jeans and listened to swing on a used phonograph. One night she watched him tapping his foot and said quietly, "We lost the war, but maybe he found a future." Still, under the rhythm of this new life, A strange unease persisted. The same kindness that had saved them now shaped them. The bread that had fed their bodies was feeding something else. Dependence. American culture filled the void the Reich had left, not by force but by familiarity. It was everywhere, on screens, in songs, even in dreams. A German newspaper editor wrote, "We are rebuilding our country in someone else's image." And yet, who could resist it? After years of ashes and guilt, America's glow felt like salvation. Soldiers were gone, but the empire remained, silent, elegant, and irresistible. Even the language changed. Words like "okay," "cool," and "weekend" slipped naturally into German speech. The occupation had ended on paper, but not in spirit. By the mid-1950s, West Germany had become a mirror of the world that conquered it. Clean streets, bright lights, endless consumption. The symbol of power was no longer the tank or the flag, but the brand. A bottle of Coca-Cola stood where a swastika once hung. A movie ticket replaced a marching order. America had discovered something no army ever could. Kindness, when repeated enough, becomes control. Still, for the people who had lived through both wars, that control felt different, less like chains, more like comfort. They had traded pride for peace, and for many it was a fair exchange. As one Berlin shopkeeper said, "They took our empire and gave us refrigerators." By then, even resentment began to fade. The children who once waited under the candy planes grew up to open stores, drive American cars, sing rock and roll. The ghosts of hunger were fading too, replaced by abundance. The new Germany was not conquered, it was convinced. And somewhere far away, in a small house in Utah, an old pilot named Gail Halvorson received a letter from Berlin. It was from a woman who had been a child when he dropped his first parachutes of chocolate. "You made us believe," she wrote, "that even enemies could be kind." Halvorson smiled, folded the letter and looked out his window at the evening sky. The same sky that had once carried bombs, then candy, now carried nothing but silence. The world had changed, not through war, but through warmth. The United States had built an empire not with soldiers, but with sweetness. The bombs had ended one war. The bread had started another, the quiet kind, the kind that conquers hearts before borders. Years passed, the world moved on. The ashes of war sank into the soil, and new buildings rose where the ruins once stood. Berlin's skyline glittered again, a monument not to conquest, but to endurance. Yet beneath the neon lights and the hum of modern life, something lingered, quiet but unforgotten, the taste of that first American bread. For the children who once caught chocolate parachutes, the war became a story told by parents, a ghost softened by memory. They grew up with music, cinema, and endless color. But for their parents, the ones who had known fire and hunger, the sweetness of that mercy never stopped tasting strange. It was gratitude and guilt mixed together, a flavor they could never name, only remember. An old man in Munich once said, "The bombs destroyed our homes, but the bread destroyed our hate." He said it without bitterness, only wonder. Because that was the paradox of mercy. It healed and humiliated at the same time. The same hands that had shattered cities had also proven that kindness could be stronger than revenge. But kindness, they learned, could also reshape nations. By the 1960s, Germany had become the symbol of Europe's rebirth, an economic miracle built on American aid, American machines, and American dreams. The hunger was gone, but the lessons remained. Pride had been replaced by pragmatism, conquest by cooperation. And somewhere deep inside, an entire generation carried a quiet understanding. Survival was not only about strength, it was about mercy. Gail Halvorson, the candy bomber, returned to Berlin decades later. The airfield at Tempelhof was silent now, its runways cracked by time. But as he walked across the old tarmac, hundreds of people gathered, children, now grown, holding their own sons and daughters. They held up paper parachutes, white and fragile, fluttering in the breeze. Halverson smiled, his eyes wet, and said softly, "You gave me as much as I gave you." For a moment, it was as if history folded in on itself, war and peace, hunger and hope, all existing together in one fragile human truth. Mercy is never forgotten. It may fade, it may ache, but it leaves a mark deeper than hatred ever could. In the years that followed, the world would find new wars, new blockades, new enemies. The planes would change, the flags would change, but the lesson would not. The smallest act of compassion can outlast the largest act of destruction. A loaf of bread, a chocolate bar, a pilot's gesture, these were the things that truly rewrote history. Because long after the bombs stopped falling, long after the treaties were signed and the soldiers went home, what people remembered most wasn't who won or who lost. It was who cared. An old German woman interviewed in the 1980s was asked what stayed with her most from those years. She didn't mention the fear, the ruins, or the rebuilding. She just smiled faintly and said, "The day I tasted real bread again." That's how history survives, not in numbers or battles, but in the quiet moments when humanity refuses to disappear. The sky that once rained fire had rained mercy, and the world would never taste the same again. For those who lived through it, that taste of sweetness after suffering, of warmth after winter, never faded. It was the flavor of contradiction, of survival, of what it means to be human.